NDN Collective is a multimodal organization that's focused on building power in Indigenous communities as a way to reach equity and justice for all people in the planet. To say simply, we do not believe that we are free until everybody's free, and we do not believe anybody's free until we are free. And so that's a little bit of grounding for our conversation today. I want to introduce our amazing panelists. Ms. Tiffany Chang is Director of Community Engagement with the Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Licia Maddox is a citizen of the Kachan Nation and the Political Director with the NDN Collective. Tammy Tiger is a descendant of the Creek Nation and a citizen of the Choctaw Nation and manages the Native Vote Project at the Las Vegas Indian Center. And finally, Ms. Colette Pichon Battle is the Executive Director of the Gulf Coast Center of Law and Policy. And so we're gonna get into a couple one-off questions with the panelists, and then we'll be talking about some bigger power building intersectional stuff as we get into it here. To start, Colette, wanted to set this up and hear some of your thoughts. Since the racial reckoning with Mr. Floyd's death in early 2020, it's translated to a higher poll turnout and a lot of advocacy happening in the Black community. Yet we know that only 59% of non-white voters turned out in 2020. Going forward, how can we use some of these cross-racial issues to keep the momentum in people turning out?
Thank you so much, Michael, and peace to everyone here. My name is Colette. I am coming in from the traditional lands of Choctaw Nation in Southeast Louisiana. I just want to say thank you to the NDN Collective for inviting us into this conversation, the lands that we're on and the peoples of this space. The question around how Black folks engage in voting is an interesting one, especially at this moment. I think we know that in Black communities, we're part of a nation that has literally dehumanized us, often rejects us, and generally discriminates against us. And so to get Black folks to participate in a system that seems to be broken and turned against us is actually a very difficult process. Even with those facts, we see that in the aftermath of George Floyd, even when President Barack Obama was running, that Black folks actually did show up to the polls, especially in the South. I know that we were, there was lots of pressure to make sure that the Black vote turned out, but really I think the bigger pressure was to make sure that the progressive mainstream vote turned out. I think as we go forward, we're going to have to reckon with the reality of Black people in this moment. COVID, of course, really did a number on the Black community. It's currently still doing a number on the Black community, if not just the health of us and our lives. Economically, especially in places like New Orleans, where Black folks make up a large part of the service industry, it's been completely gutted, and folks are really reeling and in a bad situation. How do you get folks to participate when they're feeling that kind of pain? How do you get folks to participate inside of trauma? That means the answer to getting participation up, in, and stable is that we have to actually connect the voting process with a healing process. We actually have to connect getting deeper and higher levels of engagement with long-term movement building. This is not just about turning out one day, 1 hour to push a button. This means we're gonna need investment in deep and long-term organizing. We're seeing that across the South. We're seeing that across the nation, and I think the Black vote is gonna turn out again. The question becomes, what will our allies do? So we're ready. We're moving, but this has got to be a deeper and bigger process.
Thank you, Colette. Tiffany, we know that over the last decade there's been mass mobilization and organizing in the AAPI community that's led to increases in advocacy and engagement for that population. Can you talk about what that means for the 2022 and going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. And actually, before I proceed with my response, I just wanted to acknowledge, as a Taiwanese American, second-generation immigrant, the native peoples of my indigenous island homeland, the Amis, the Atayal, the Bunun, the Halalua, the Kanavu, the Kavalan, the Paiwan, the Pinayumayan, the Truku, the Rukai, the Saisiat, the Sidik, the Sakizaya, and the Yami peoples. And as an Asian American, as somebody who, as an immigrant coming up in the United States and being sort of displaced and dislocated in a different way, I just wanted to name that because I feel like as organizers, we all benefit from interrogating and investigating our relationship to indigeneity. It makes us better organizers by giving us a context in which to relate to each other and this land that by force or by choice we have made our home. And also I just wanted to start with gratitude again for the NDN Collective inviting us into this space together. To answer your question, Michael, I think a lot of folks are starting to realize that Asian Americans are the fastest growing electorate. Right here in Pennsylvania, there was a 29% increase over the past 10 years as opposed to an 8% decrease in the overall population. And this is largely true across states, most states. In fact, North Dakota and South Dakota have the fastest growing Asian American population. So yes, there is so much room for solidarity work for us to not form our silos in the beginning, but to start organizing on the ground together. And I also wanted to talk about the issues first, because I think we all in this room agree that solidarity is survival, right? But we also have the data on our side, right? So the Asian Americans Advancing Justice and API Vote and AAPI Data just released an Asian American voter survey. And just to set a baseline, a couple of top lines I wanted to share was that more than 2/3 of registered Asian Americans surveyed say they plan to vote, but only half have been contacted by either major parties. About half of Asian American registered voters surveyed say they prefer to cast their ballots by mail or drop-off box, which means that the voter suppression that's happening in so many of our states is going to adversely affect the communities that made the most difference in 2020. Also, Asian American respondents ranked healthcare, jobs and the economy, crime, education, gun control, and the environment as extremely important. And 77% of those surveyed agree that the United States should have stricter gun laws. And by a 2-to-1 margin, Asian American registered voters oppose bans on books and bans on lessons about racism and American history. So I share all of this, and of course you can look up the report yourself, but just to set a baseline that Asian Americans, while we're largely sort of stereotyped as being apolitical, we actually share many of the same values and priorities as the people in this room and the people in this building. And so if you do not have an Asian American outreach strategy, please get in touch with me and I will connect you. But certainly, Michael, I think we in 2020 talked about the Asian American community being the margin of victory. And in Georgia, we saw that there was an 84% increase in voter turnout between 2016 and 2020. And so what that means for 2022 is that we need to work together to ensure that misinformation and disinformation isn't being spread through ethnic channels like WeChat, like Kakao Talk, for instance. And I can talk a little bit about that later. But also that we continue the solidarity organizing that we saw be so successful in Georgia. Our future really depends on it, and I think that the response that we've seen against the Asian American vote and against the immigrant vote, the black vote in general, shows exactly what's working, which is banding together and building power together and organizing together.
Yeah, thank you. I think your point is well made. There was a Brennan Center report on the 2020 election that showed that roughly 71% of white people, eligible voters, participated in the 2020 election, and we're off by more than 10 points in all of the other racial designations that are represented here. So in the Asian American community, we had about a 59% turnout, a 62% in the black community, 58% in the Latino community, and the numbers are not available for Indian country, which is interesting, another place of opportunity. Thinking about that, Ms. Tammy Tiger, obviously a huge organizing push and advocacy literacy that you're doing there in Nevada. Can you talk about how your work at Native Vote has been helping connect the urban community with the rural Indigenous nations?
Absolutely. And thank you. It's an honor to be with you all today. I'd like to begin with introducing myself in my grandmother's language. Halito, su ochifayat, Tammy Tiger, Chaptasia, Muskogisia, Oklash inla Okla Nuwu. And my name is Tammy Tiger. Again, I am a citizen of Choctaw Nation here from Las Vegas, Nevada, the ancestral lands of the Southern Paiute people. I do the lead on civic engagement work with the Las Vegas Indian Center, and one of the primary priorities that we've had is unifying the voice in Nevada of tribal citizens and urban natives. Nevada has one of the fastest growing Native American populations, and in 2020 we saw the census results come in with an 89% increase. We have a very diverse state, one of the most diverse in the West, I think, so we're pushing for the first in the West caucus. But in Nevada, there are 28 tribal nations, councils, and bands, along with an urban Native population of over 63,000, and that represents over 100 tribes. So bringing together all of our voices to solidify power at the polls, power in the legislative session, has been really effective for us in our last session in 2021. And so working all throughout the state, going to the rural areas, and educating our urban natives on the issues that affect not only Nevada tribes, but our people in generally on those issues that are aligned and similar in every way.
Thank you for that, Tammy. And finally, Licia, I was interested to have you talk a little bit about NDN's Go Vote Then Civic Engagement program, which looks to engage Native youth in the electoral processes and in power building generally in our communities. Can you talk about the momentum built in 2020 and what are you seeing happening this year?
Thank you. Goet skamada mubak, menyanyum nyat nyahaps skaman. My name is Licia Maddox. I'm a citizen of the Quechan Indian Nation, and I serve as the political director at Indian Collective. And I just want to take a step back and say that I just feel very honored to be sitting next to these wonderful matriarchs here that are deeply rooted in their communities and truly listen to the frontline voices. A lot of the work that I do, I'm engaging directly with political power, but what I like to do is make sure to bring those grassroots voices to make sure that these politicals are accessible, because we have to remind ourselves that politicals are public servants, and I think that sometimes they like to forget that. So tipping the balance of power back to the people is one of our priorities here at Indian Collective. And thank you for the question, Michael. So I'm hearing lots of different things that all kind of just encapsulate here. And I know we talked about statistics from the 2020 census, and I think that to ground us here, American Indian Alaska Native people have been historically, since the beginning of census, the highest undercounted population. Going into 2020, we were the highest undercounted population by 4.9%, and that was nearly double the next population group. In 2020, the results didn't get any better. The COVID-19 pandemic really, really thwarted a lot of our organizing efforts because tribal nations were deeply affected. Navajo Nation was one of the highest affected populations, indigenous populations in the U.S., and so the getting out the count was a huge struggle for us. And what we really wanted to make sure that we were doing, our organizing strategy up to that point, was to really get these communities engaged so we could be counted, because when we're counted, we have a seat at the table. When you're missing from the data, you're missing from key political conversations, you're missing from appropriations conversations, and you're definitely missing from the eyes of the community. And so just to kind of get back to the census numbers, more than 80% of Native people actually live in urban areas. And so among you all, in your homelands, there are large Native populations. And so if that is one point of a telling story, there are Indigenous people right next to you. And so for us to be included into the conversation and really just grounding ourselves in the education aspect of things. And so when we talk about, what was our organizing strategy, we have to kind of take a step back and say, well, it was a big learning year for our communities. It was really indigenous people in urban areas and in rural areas showing up, but then it also showed the voter suppression realities that we faced, urban and rural. There was a report in 2020 released by the Native American Rights Fund that showed that Native voting in key states was being suppressed at extremely high levels for various reasons. For not having enough access to ballot boxes, tribes were not being consulted in terms of where to place these ballot boxes. Elections offices were refusing to engage with tribes on where to put these ballot boxes. Non-traditional addresses were also an issue in delivering mail-in ballots. That was the big strategy, right? Is don't worry, everybody can just mail in their ballot. Well, for Indigenous people, as sovereign nations, we have the authority to make our own addressing systems, and that's part of our inherent rights. And so for the U.S. Postal Service to not be collaborating with tribal nations and figuring out how to include us in this really important democratic process was also a huge issue. So that made organizations like Tammy's organization and NDN Collective, National Congress of American Indians, Native Organizers Alliance, Illuminative, it put all the pressure on nonprofit organizations to go into communities with very little resources, because we know 0.1% of philanthropic dollars go into indigenous communities. And so we had to figure out where to get funds on our own, and then we also had to figure out how to actually go into these communities. So what we did was we tapped on trusted messengers. We made sure that we were using our deep relationships with these communities as community-based organizations, and really leaning on those leader voices in those communities, whether they're urban or rural, to make sure that we were resourcing them as best as we could. And this is what we see every time. We see funders coming in at the 11th hour, weeks before elections, and try to drop dollars on our communities, and then think that we have the infrastructure to be able to distribute those dollars into our communities. And with tribal nations, we are sovereign governments. So that means that there's a process. There is a bureaucratic process, just like other governments, that things have to go to. So dollars get trapped and they don't make it to the front lines. So therefore, those dollars don't get distributed like they should. So we're always working on shoestring budgets to try to make this happen, yet we did, because we trusted each other. We trusted that now was the time that we were going to be able to really express our political power, and the indigenous vote actually was the margin of victory in Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada. And now we have politicals really watching, but Tiffany spoke to propensity scores earlier. What's the likelihood that indigenous people are going to vote and engage with these systems that are not made for us, So it makes our job very difficult when we're going in trying to convince our indigenous people that we want to participate in a system that sways in the opposite direction of which way we're trying to go. And generally, it's to try to repeal a lot of our sovereignty, because the extractive industries really want to be able to use our sacred sites. In Nevada, Thacker Pass, this huge electrification and electrifying cars, and that whole strategy that the current administration has, that lithium is coming from a sacred site that indigenous people still find holy. Just like churches and, national treasures of different countries, we hold our places close to us that way. And so we see that in Oak Flat. There's a copper mining issue over there right now that is actually putting the aquifers that feed into LA and Phoenix clean water during a drought, at risk. And so when we're talking about, what do we do now? Well, we have to unify together, because all of us know that the climate crisis is real. It's affecting Black and brown communities at higher rates than other communities. We are literally on the front lines of the effects of those things. So when we're standing together and trying to figure out what representatives should be in those seats, they have to have our political agenda forefront, and as the stewards, the traditional stewards of those lands, listening to the first scientists. Indigenous people are the first scientists of this land. That is a fact. We have been around for thousands of years, and we have learned these ecosystems so very well that we're able to use that traditional knowledge to try to find solutions, but nobody's coming to us for these solutions. The consultation process does not exist. And so we're pushing for consent as part of our strategy. Free, prior, and informed consent is a part of the United Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. That is something that the United States has endorsed. And so now we want to double down and make sure that they're really sticking to that. And we need everyone's help because the water crisis, the climate crisis, the food crisis, the housing crisis, the education crisis, it is not an Indigenous issue. It is all of our issues.
Thank you, Licia.
Yes.
All right, thank you guys for that. I want to open up a couple questions for the whole panel. I'd love to hear all your reflections on it, but don't feel pressured to answer. So first thing I was interested in kind of bringing up is obviously we've been seeing a huge swell in youth engagement over the past 2 years, or the past 2 election cycles. So we know that the youth increased their participation by about 11 points across the board in the 2020 election. Coupling that with this idea of being ignored by the major parties and the disaffected voters that happen when they don't see themselves or their issues addressed by the political process, can you guys just talk a little bit about how in your movement you're looking to ensure youth engagement and keeping the youth actively civically engaged? And Tiffany, let's start with you.
So I guess, excuse me, I guess my approach to working with youth is to stay out of their way. I think we don't empower our youth enough, and I think it's partially because of the way the nonprofit industrial complex works, that we burn them out instead of building them up. And so something that my organization is working on right now is to connect youth networks across communities and across boundaries. So, for example, my organization, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AJC, has a twice-yearly youth leadership summit. And something that I've been talking to my team about is how we have so many organizations that have these youth programs. And in our case, we have young Asian Americans, mostly college-aged, coming to DC either virtually or in person to get trained in advocacy, strategic communications, and at the end of the week, we actually have them go to the Hill and do lobby visits, or legislative visits, sorry, C3. But then they go back to their states, their universities, their campuses, and what I'm hearing as I meet with Asian leaders across the country is that our youth feel very siloed once they return home, right? A lot of them may end up in the major metropolises like DC or New York, but a lot of them don't. And we know that all politics are local, right? So how do we actually connect those networks and provide those spaces for community creation that will sustain the work? Because it's not enough to just educate our youth on the policies. They can learn that. I've seen this. They can learn that in 2 days. They can. I had a student in our YLS program, a queer transgender student from Virginia, put Ted Cruz's staff on their heels, and that they're really, 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 really smart. And I think it's that lack of community that is often the case. I think like creating spaces for them to continue to sustain each other and to empower each other. It's not just about what goes through their heads and what their knowledge base or their analysis of the policies. It's, do they feel cared for, and do they feel empowered by the movement spaces that we're bringing them into? Is there follow-up? Is there a concerted effort to mentor them? Because we know that we don't want to be doing this, we will be doing this work forever, but it shouldn't be the case that that knowledge and that experience just stays within the leadership. We should be building up youth to replace us as leaders, because they are the ones who are closest and feel the effects most of our gun violence epidemic, of our climate crisis. And, you know, in the most recent mobilization that we organized, we had a youth, you know, intern come in and just start reaching out to campuses using TikTok. I don't know how to use TikTok, y'all. If somebody can like do a quick, if there's a tutorial out there, or a session during this conference, let me know. But yeah, like staying out of their way. Don't underestimate their potential for leadership, for collaboration, for innovation, for creativity, because that creativity, that radical imagination is what gets us from sort of sustaining a progressive movement to actually moving towards collective liberation.
Beautiful, thank you. Tammy.
I had this conversation with someone recently, and I'm like, we're talking about how we're engaging the youth, and we've been reaching out to high schools more this election season. And I'm like, I don't know, I remember watching Schoolhouse Rocks and and those cartoons that were on, and it was kind of like a part of a conversation at home. And I think in the Native community, we had to really think about what connects us and what is going to engage us. And there's an Indian center up north that came out with a great slogan or spiel. It's called Make Voting a Tradition. And so we've been looking at just all the different ways to engage with, especially urban Native youth, because we're very diverse amongst our backgrounds and the tribes that we come from. So one of those initiatives came about in 2020. We passed Indigenous Peoples Day in our county, and our county is the largest county in the state. And we actually passed it for it to be on the second Monday of October. And so this initiative for Indigenous Peoples Day started at the university, and it started with the UNLV passing Indigenous Peoples Day as a proclamation. And so we gathered those youth together, had them come and testify at the county meeting to advocate for it. And so when, like Licia mentioned, those fundings came in at the last minute for 2020 elections, those were the same youth that I went out to because they were already kind of engaged and they knew these issues that mattered to them and what was important. And we recruited them to train them how to do voter registration, train them how to make a voting plan and get to the polls. And so our majority of our 2020 election strategy was engaging the youth to engage their families and their communities all through relational organizing. And so it was really, really effective for us statewide. And so that's what I was thinking about when you talked about how do we get them engaged. And then this year, what we've really been focused on that we didn't do in 2020 is going out to the high schools. In Nevada, you can pre-register to vote at 17. So we're looking at the data, which is very poor, and so we kind of have to know where the families that we know are, work with our school district's Indian education program, and see where these families live, and then go to those high schools and have voter registration. So there's multifaceted ways that we have to look towards engaging our youth.
Thank you, Tammy. Colette, would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, this is really exciting, and I think it's a really good time to ask this question. What I can remember is the love and excitement when President Obama was running and what that was to get youth out, right? To be excited about the potential of our country, turning a page, doing something better, and what that is to drive energy to the polls based on love and excitement. And then to watch this last round based on anger and fire, right? And how you can drive folks to the polls based on anger and fire because we just can't believe what is happening and how to get the youth to turn out. I think it's an important moment to ask this question because those of us who went through Hurricane Katrina will tell you that we're in a moment now of deep trauma and sadness. And what is it going to be to get folks to the polls in this energy and in this emotion? A lesson that we learned 17 years ago, it'll be 17 years since Katrina this month. A lesson that we learned was the years that come after, the recovery years, are when folks are actually going through deep mental strain. And in particular, a group that got completely missed was the youth. We had some of the highest suicide rates, we had some of the highest mental health impacts, and it was because of that disaster. COVID and what is happening on our planet right now is that such disaster. It's the kind of thing that even if you survive, you don't really know that it impacted you, but it did. And if you're young and your brain is still forming and you're doing all of these other things, it's really impacting you. And so I think to ask this question is, I really want to agree, Tiffany, with the approach that you mentioned, and we're doing a lot of the similar things. We're hosting a Black Climate Leaders Summit and a Black Climate Leadership Summit. And we could do training on TikTok and things like that, but what we're hearing is that people feel really alone. They feel really disconnected. They feel like rejected. They feel, how can we learn how to step into our leadership? And so we're going to create a space where we have established Black climate leaders, lawyers, advocates, folks who run the spectrum, folks who work on oceans, folks who work on environmental justice, literally do wisdom circles with the folks who come in, where we bring back an African tradition of sitting in a circle, right? Not I tell you what to do, but let's talk to each other about how we do this together and how we sustain ourselves, and bringing African tradition into our sustainability. And then letting those spaces really level up priorities and issues. I think the opportunity here, especially in this moment of engagement, is around prioritizing work, yes, but really lifting values. Because what we've lost as this nation is our shared values. We don't have shared values and principles. We don't articulate them. We certainly need a shared strategy, but the other thing that we need is some space to actually remember what it is to sit in a circle and heal each other. Mm-hmm. Remember what it is to build that energy and let it drive you both to the polls, but also in your work as you continue forward. And so I think, the last piece of exchange that happens is, unbound youthful energy can be destructive. And there has to be some exchange of lessons learned and wisdom. And I like to use the word discipline, although I know my friends in the next generation don't like to use that word. But it is a word that I think is missing from this entire sector. What is the discipline of engaging in a new tradition? You have to go, you have to engage. Look at what the other side can do when they get people to turn out to vote. We can do the same thing, but we have to make it a longer engagement. And I think the discipline around our own democracy and our own liberation is what we should lift up. That's not the same thing as saying who to vote for, right? Or what to vote for. That is not the same process. So the gatherings of folks to show you're not alone, we are listening, there are things for you to learn. You don't know everything. You know a lot. You know a lot. You don't know everything. Let's do it together. But when we sit together in a circle, a lot of what is driving our pain, our anger, our harm, a lot of that can be healed if we just reconnect and then go forward together. Yeah. Ashe. Ashe.
If you can hold questions, I'm going to get to you at the end here, okay? Licia.
Yeah, sure. Just loving this because what are we doing right now? We're centering youth and taking ourselves out of the center. Mm-hmm. And if we really empower youth by giving them that platform, then we meet them where they are, and where are they right now? They're in creative spaces. They're, doing art is resistance, music is resistance, and we're meeting them in those places or creating spaces where they're able to do those things, use their voice, show their creativity, let us know what they know so we can meet them in the middle. And from an Indigenous lens, this is something that we practice in our communities at all. We think about the next 7 generations. We think about the 3 generations behind us, the generation that we're in, and the 3 generations ahead of us. And if we can all start thinking about what's next and start, clearing that path, what we're doing right now is we're still just moving the blocks out of the way, and these youth are going to take it to the next level. So from just all this political education that we're talking about, they're yearning for that. They're trying to figure out, what do these systems do? Why are they broken? And let's come up with really creative strategies on how to create the democracy that we want to see, that we want to live in. So we have to do that baseline education with them, even though there is a lot of resistance to these systems, but we have to teach them how to play the game, Mm-hmm. But they're also teaching us how to play a different game too, because they're looking at things from a completely different perspective. And That's so right. The other thing that I'd be remiss if I didn't say is that we got to start with education, accurate education. And if we're not talking about, the accuracy of the genocide and the destruction of culture, land, bodies, those things, and really just acknowledging that up front, these youth are not going to grow up having their true identity so that they can step into their full power. So collectively, what we need to do is be fighting for that accurate history across the board. We need to peel off that Band-Aid and really start moving toward accurate education so that these children, these young people can grow up healing instead of like us, we're adults and we're trying to heal now, and we pass trauma through generations. It's a fact. It is a scientific fact that trauma is passed down through generations. So, starting with being able to have these difficult conversations. It's not easy to talk about, all of the past of how this country, the foundations that it was built on, but it's a needed conversation so we can get to the part where we get to healing, and then we can sit in these circles in a good way, cross community, and be able to get to these educations and these organizing strategies that involve all of us, not just siloed from community to community.
That's right.
Thank you for
Wonderful.
that question.
Can I add something?
Yeah, please.
I wanted to respond to what Colette and Licia just mentioned, and something that really resonated with me, Colette, was when you talked about our cultural resources as communities of color. This is deeply personal to me, and something that I think that all communities of color, all marginalized communities, may be able to relate to, because I think one common denominator is this force of the force of assimilation and the erasure of our languages and our cultures, and being made to believe that that is inferior to what we're being taught in this, settler colonialist, like capitalist, society. When in fact, so many of the cultural resources that we bring, the spiritual resources that we bring, I'm thinking about in the Asian American community, the Sikh American community, the notion of Chardikala, which is eternal optimism. How could we have gotten through Oak Creek? How could we have gotten through decades of anti-Asian violence without that leadership, without that mentality, right? And more recently, as misinformation, disinformation just becomes so commonplace, the practice of talk story in Filipino communities has been helping to preempt the adoption of misinformation about COVID-19, about the elections. And so, I think that's something that is part of our healing, as whether we are immigrants or Indigenous, is tapping back into and revaluing our connections with our ancestors and the lessons that they've passed on to us, because that's exactly what makes us resilient. And so I just wanted to speak to that, because that's incredibly powerful. And yeah, I definitely agree with Licia that the political education needs to start as young as possible, right? Like when I think about, speaking of misinformation, disinformation, the erasure of communities of color, the erasure of indigenous stories and histories from our classrooms, from our curricula, that is a form of misinformation by default, right? And so what we're seeing, nationwide is, for instance, Asian American parents and communities really being galvanized around curriculum reform, and they're coming to us for support. And what we're telling them, and what we don't have to tell some of them, is that there are also pre-existing efforts and bills to teach Black history, Indigenous history, Chicano history, and that in order to make progress, we all have to work together, because some of these legislators are just never going to give us the time of day. And so again, a word toward, just sort of a nod towards Licia's comment on education and how that is our responsibility, but is to pass on the cultural and spiritual resources to the next generation, but also to build political power. We have to work together to make sure that political education and diverse and culturally responsive histories are taught in our schools as well.
Thank you, Tiffany. That was awesome. All right, guys, I'm going to switch this up a little bit. I want to talk about the power of solidarity. And I want to set this up in a way that recognizes how as one indicator, the electorate composition has changed over the last 10 years, right? So we know back in the 2012 election that non-white voters represented about 22% of the voting population, or the voters that voted in that election. In 2020, that number raised to over 28%. Okay, so what we're seeing is movement coming out of each one of these these segmentations towards more positive engagement in civic activity. Recognizing that we're operating within the systems of white supremacy and acculturation, really systems that weren't built for our people to take advantage of these power systems and things that have been set up, coupled with the decade of organizing that's had been happening in our communities and the momentum that's been created. Can you guys, I'd love to hear one or two things from each of you about where the opportunities of solidarity and support are in the near term, in this current election cycle, but also as we continue to think about power building as a strategy into the future. Tammy.
So I mentioned earlier how we work with the Native community to bring together the urban and the tribal voices, but we also, the real power behind all of the work that is happening in Nevada comes from working in solidarity with the other underrepresented communities. We work on a coalition of a table of these different organizations, and we back each other up. We coordinate resources. There's a lead organization on each of these important issues, and then we all uplift each other and make sure that our voices are heard. And so working with other organizations and working in coalition together has been essential, and just really the strength behind everything that has been passed in Nevada. I think we passed 6 new voting laws in 2021. Those polling sites on tribal nations, those laws couldn't have passed if we didn't have that coalition and support behind us.
Great. Licia, you want to go next?
Yeah, I'll just piggyback off of that and just say that representation matters. So regardless of what community you're from, we really need to start empowering and uplifting folks from our communities to be our voices and our representatives, because we see that those folks are the ones that are actually making the change in DC that we see in our communities. And so I would say that, making sure that you're cultivating leaders. We work with a partner Advanced Native Political Leadership Program that's trying to train 16,000 Indigenous people to run for office, and that would help us reach parity. Right now, 0.9% representation in Congress isn't getting us very much in terms of helping us fight for our sovereign rights. And when we have our rights, then we're able to, have that collective liberation strategy. And so, I would just say that, we need to be cultivating those leaders, and we need to, as communities, get behind those leaders together.
Colette, I'm extremely interested to hear your answer to this question, given this is the crux of Gulf Coast policy.
Yeah, I'm excited to say that the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy has shifted from a local organization working regionally into a national organization working globally, and we're now Taproot Earth. And we've shifted because the climate crisis, which is what we focus on, is not local. Although Katrina was very local, and that woke us up and that really catalyzed us, what we have now been able to acknowledge and started building solidarity around is that there's a global climate movement that is happening, and we've got to connect to it. I think the short-term opportunity is really to build movement infrastructure. Movement infrastructure includes the ability to engage in short-term political moments like voting. But for Black folks, for Native folks, for our API community, this is bigger than a vote. This is about building movement and long-term movement. And so in order to build movement, and what we were seeing in the South was a real lack of what I would call movement infrastructure. And movement infrastructure just means, do folks across 5 Gulf states know how to be in touch with each other? Do folks know when trainings are happening? Do people know when other actions are happening? Because the work is happening. People are fighting. The resistance is here and alive, and it has been since the beginning of this country. The problem is that there are breakdowns in how we connect to one another. Either technological breakdowns, I just don't have your phone number, or I don't know how to use the Zoom or whatever. But there are other breakdowns that have to do with how our communities have been strategically pitted against each other. And so movement infrastructure also includes spaces for reconciliation and conversation and building relationships. We were able to do a Sacred Waters pilgrimage down the Mississippi River with Black and Native women and Two-Spirit folk, and the whole process was to heal our relationship with each other and with Mother Earth. It was really not a conversation for other people to be a part of. It was for Black and Indigenous women and Two-Spirit folk to say, I know what happened to us. I realized what we were required to do to each other. We have to reconcile. We have to move forward. And by the way, the stuff they're putting in your agriculture in Iowa is coming down the Mississippi and creating the dead zone in Louisiana. And by the way, this is rooted in oil and gas coming out of the ground and harming us. You can make these connections if you make these connections, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the infrastructure that has to be built. I would just say there's a long-term opportunity to connect to the global movement. Shout out to all of our brothers and sisters in South America and in the Caribbean and in Africa and in Asia who are rising up. I was sitting with some youngsters just a couple days ago who are part of movements that have changed governments. I mean, peace to the people in Puerto Rico who got their governor out with a dance party. You know what I'm saying? Let's do that and be inspired by that. But there's not just our election cycle in the U.S. That is our privileged U.S.-ness that makes us focus on this. There is a movement happening globally, which is about change and reclaiming ourselves, reconnecting with our indigeneity, and really understanding who we are. And the long-term opportunity is to connect with that. This moment of election should catalyze that long-term moment of solidarity.
I think you just said land back.
Land back.
Colette.
Land back.
So, yes, and just piggybacking off of something Tiffany said earlier about connection, Indigenous people, we get our connection from the land. We are connected to the land, and that is how we thrive. That is where our spiritual connection is, and when we're able to reconnect back to our land, we can truly step back into our power. So another long-term strategy would be helping Indigenous people get Indigenous land back into Indigenous hands.
Yes.
Tiffany, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there are enormous opportunities, but we do need resources for building infrastructure, not just responding to events and crises, but building the connections necessary. After the Atlanta spa shootings in Georgia, the Asian American community was completely overwhelmed. And it's not that we didn't have communities already working with victims of gender-based and sexual violence, with people who were formerly incarcerated, with undocumented immigrants. We didn't really have an infrastructure for building power. So we were in this situation where our organization was just slammed with requests and offers of assistance, and I'm like, I wish I knew exactly who to turn to, and exactly who to call in Nevada, in Washington, in Iowa, who can respond and to provide resources for our community members. And so that was a huge turning point, I think, in the modern movement. But also, I would even say that there is this hunger, especially among young Asian American progressives, for a movement space, for a movement home. And not just after Atlanta, but after Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. I think there is this dialectic that's really missing around, how do we create this notion of community when it's sort of been forced upon us by this label of Asian American, representing 50 ethnicities, 100 different languages, and how do we find our home within the movement spaces that already exist without erasing or co-opting anyone else's work, right? And so that's kind of how the idea for the Unity March came about. So the Unity March just passed, we held it on the National Mall on June 25th, and it was the first BIPOC, Asian American-led, multi-issue march on the mall. And to date, it is also the best attended and most watched. We have about 45,000 views online. And in that, it was super important for us to use it as a space, not as a rally just for Stop Asian Hate, because, spoiler alert, Stop Asian Hate is not a sustainable movement unless you contextualize it within this greater struggle for collective liberation. Sure. Because we cannot be calling for more law enforcement when law enforcement has never been for us, right? And so, a lot of political education around alternatives to law enforcement and kind of rebuilding the connections between Asian Americans and other communities of color against this huge wave of disinformation that is designed to stoke anti-Blackness in Asian communities that our organization is working to keep our tech companies accountable and our platforms accountable to curb that misinformation, spread of misinformation. But I just wanted to share as like a sort of a closing anecdote that when the idea of the Unity March came about and we realized it could not just be a Stop Asian Hate rally on a large scale, that it had to involve everybody that has been historically targeted with violence and hate. And so our executive director went and talked to the National Action Network, Reverend Al Sharpton. He was like, I'm down, I'll support you. I reached out to Dr. Jim Zogby at Arab American Institute, and he was like, yeah, we're here for it. Because when 9/11 happened and we were getting hate mail and we were getting death threats, the Japanese American community rallied for us and held vigils for us. There is precedent and there is proof that solidarity is survival. And I just want to also thank NDN Collective for the outreach they did to get Native voices as part of the program. And I think the fact that it resonated with so many people kind of shows what a hunger there is to create these multiracial, cross-racial, intersectional spaces, and to keep building, because people are already asking me, like, when's the next Unity March? And I might have to, take that to Colette and Tammy and Lisa and be like, hey, we're gonna do this again. So I just wanted to end with that there is so much more like love and support out there than we might think when we're, told that we're alone and that we're powerless.
Thank you guys so much for that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I forgot to add my future comment. Yeah, and it's very brief. But civic engagement has to happen year-round, every day, all the time. You don't just register people to vote and then forget about them.
That's right.
The turnout relies on that community, that relationship building. And so what we do, we integrate voter registration, education on issues in everything that we do at the Indian Center, because we're not only a voting rights organization, we also are primarily socioeconomic nonprofit organization. So housing, workforce assistance and training. We're doing a garden. We're going to have people a table there to register people to vote. Education, scholarships, everything that we do, we have a table there about voting and election education.
And those are issue areas too,
Yeah.
So if we can rally people around the things that affect them the most, then we can create those evergreen civic engagement strategies. But we also have to tap on the folks that have the big pockets to fund those evergreen civic engagement strategies,
Yes.
to build that infrastructure and sustain the infrastructure in between election years. And that's what the big gap is right now.
Yeah.
Year-round funding.
So if I was to pull out some of the highlights of this amazing conversation, and thank you so much for these leaders and matriarchs of their movements. I'm just honored to be here with you today. Thank you. A call for sustained resources so that we can continue building our mechanisms and infrastructure during off-cycle times. This idea about how we're empowering youth and bringing them in as leaders and not qualifying their experiences. The issue around issue engagement, right? Environment, economies, the quality of life. These are the opportunities for us to have solidarity around. And then finally, what's going to make that really real is the relationships and the togetherness that we can do this together. I would bring back that fact that, the growing composition of non-white voters in this country, we're 28% of the electorate. Elections can't be won without us. And so we have to use that as a point of power. And I would say, kind of in closing, I heard this quote from a friend recently, and he said, the maximum that you ask for is the minimum of what you'll receive. And I think that has a lot of bearing in this conversation. So again, thank you guys so much. I did want to open up the floor to see if there was any questions.
Well, I want to make a comment. I'm on the East Coast. I'm in Pennsylvania and Philly. I do a lot of work across the state. But what I think is so necessary is to take this and take all of you and have a national conversation alive. I'm doing a Women of Color conversation series with some of our elected candidates for Congress and governor and all that. But I want to invite you guys, because I have a coalition page, and I So I wanted to say that, and I wanted to agree with you about young people. The wisdom circles, they don't, letting them go their way is one thing, but they need guidance. They really need guidance today. So I just want to give kudos to this. You did an excellent job in really pulling out everything. We need to take you guys and what you're doing down south, DC and the West, to this Mid-Atlantic region, because I think we're a bit jaded over here.
I'm recognizing opportunities for solidarity and power building here, so thank you for that.
So I work in the Pacific Northwest, which is a really wonderful hub for LGBTQ rights.
Yep.
I'm my terrible husband is so politics. Well, no, that's Northwest is not quite in the state. And I'm curious, I'm trying to bring in that diversity to my area and my connections in my community. But also I'm a little bit younger, I don't have the connection. And so I'm curious if you might have some advice on like where to find folks, like where do I connect with people like you all and find that guidance and that mentorship in a place that doesn't have as much of that?
So just paraphrasing that for our streaming audience, we're looking at how we can provide opportunities of solidarity of these different movements in the context, especially of youth organizing. Panel?
Yeah, I would say for Indigenous people, because of the large Indigenous population in urban areas, there are a lot of urban centers that are very active. So the National Urban Indian Family Coalition is actually based out of the Pacific Northwest area, and they are essentially the hub of the resources and information and connections that go out through Indian country. So we can certainly pass along that information. But actually, the tribes in the Pacific Northwest have a lot of political power.
Yeah.
They were in Washington State, President Von Sharp from the Quinault Nation. She's vice president now, but at the time when she was president, she was actually able to codify some rights out in that area for free, prior, and informed consent, which has never been done before. So there is political power out there to lean on, and I think that panels like this or discussions like this will just, open up the opportunities so that we're out there, because I mean we are still here, and I'm sure that you all have national plugs too, but there are centers that we're happy to patch people into. And especially the LGBTQ2S+ community as well.
Colette, last words.
Yeah, I want to say two things. There's a difference between diversity and anti-Blackness, and we as a group of people have to start getting our minds around that. I think there's a movement to push us all to, a perceived unity, but it's not there yet. And anti-Blackness is a real thing. I just came from the Pacific Northwest, and I was like, what is going on here? It's not diverse. It is diverse. It was lots of people from lots of places. I heard lots of different languages and everything. But there's anti-Blackness and there's diversity. So that's one piece. I think the other thing, and one way to connect, and we would love to connect with you at Taproot Earth, what's happening in the Pacific Northwest and off your coast is happening in the Gulf Coast. It's happening off the Atlantic coast. It's happening in the Pacific. We should get our people together, because the industries that are taking and harming us and even putting the propaganda in our communities to hate each other are the same companies. It's like 6 of them.
That's right.
And if all of our coasts were together and moving together, we could take it down. And so I say let's connect what is happening to you to what is happening to us, and let's move together.
Yeah.
Last word of thanks for the panel and for Netroots for hosting this important conversation today, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you.